Book 5, Section 4 of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, If we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? It has been already declared above what there is set forth in the interpretation of these names. Therefore, because we are in haste to reach the unexamined parts, we forbear to unfold again what has been already delivered. Accordingly, this is to be heedfully observed, that they that bear the semblance of heretics begin to speak softly, saying, If we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? For heretics dread to increase their hearers at the outset of their communing with them, lest they be listened to with ears on the watch, and they carefully shun the paining of them, that they may catch their unguardedness. And what they put forward is almost always mild, while that is harsh which they cunningly introduce in going on. And hence at this time the friends of Job begin with the reverence of a gentle address, but they burst forth even to launching the darts of the bitterest invectives. For the roots of thorns themselves are soft, yet from that very softness of their own they put forth that whereby they pierce. It goes on, But who can hold in the discourse conceived? There be three kinds of men which differ from one another by qualities carried forward in gradation. For there are some who at the same time that they conceive evil sentiments to speak, restrain themselves in their speech by none of the graveness of silence. And there are others who, whereas they conceive evil things, withhold themselves with a strong control of silence. And there are some who, being made strong by the exercise of virtue, are advanced even to so great a height, that as to speaking, they do not even conceive any evil thoughts in the heart, which they should have to restrain by keeping silence. It is shown then to what class Eliphaz belongs, who bears witness that he cannot withhold his conceived discourse, whereunto he made this known, that he knew that he would give offense by speaking, for he would never be anxious to withhold words that he cannot, unless he were assured beforehand that he would be inflicting wounds by the same. For good men check precipitancy of speech with the reins of counsel, and they take heedful thought, lest, by giving a loose to the wantonness of the tongue, they should by heedlessness of speech pierce their hearers' spirits. Hence it is well said by Solomon, He that letteth out water is a head of strife. For the water is let out when the flowing of the tongue is let loose, and he that letteth out water is made the beginning of strife, and that by the inconstancy of the lips the commencement of discord is afforded. Thus, as the wicked are light in mind, so are they precipitate in speech, and neglect to keep silence, thoroughly considering what they should say. And what a light spirit conceives, a lighter tongue delivers apace. Hence on this occasion Eliphaz infers from his own experience a thing which in a feeling of hopelessness he believes concerning all men, saying, But who can withhold this conceived discourse? It proceeds, verses 3 and 4. Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. Thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. If the text of the historical account be regarded in itself, it is of great service to the reader, that in blessed Job, instead of the ripping up of vices, proclaim is made of his virtues by his reviling friends. For the testimony to our manner of life is never so strong as when commendable things are told by him, who aims to fasten guilt upon our head. But let us consider of what a lofty height that man was, who by instructing the ignorant, strengthening the weak, upholding the faltering, amid the cares of his household, amidst the charge of countless concerns, amidst the anxious feelings for his children, amidst the pursuit of so many laborious occupations, devoted himself to putting others in the right way. And being busied indeed, he executed these offices, yet being free, he did service in the master's office of instruction. By exercising superintendence, he disposed of temporal things. By preaching, he announced eternal truths. A brightness of life, both by practice he showed to all bearers, and by speech he conveyed to all that heard him. But all that are either heretics or bad men, in recording the excellencies of the good, turn them into grounds of accusation. Hence Eliphaz deduces occasion of reviling against blessed Job from the same quarter, whence he related commendable things of him, for it goes on, verse 5, But now it is come upon thee, and thou faintest, it toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. All men of forward mind assail the life of the righteous in two ways, for either they assert that what they say is wrong, or that what they say aright they never observe. And hence blessed Job is reproved by his friends further on for his mode of speech, whereas now he is torn in pieces for having spoken right things, but not having observed them. And so at one time the speech, and at another time the practice of the good, meets with the disapproval of the wicked, in order that either the tongue, being rebuked, may hold its peace, or the life, being convicted by the testimony of that same tongue of theirs, may give way under the charge. And mark that first they bring forward commendations of the tongue, and afterwards complain of the weakness of the life. For the wicked, that they may not openly show themselves to be evil, sometimes say good things of the just, as they know to be already received concerning them by others also. But as we have said above, these very points they forthwith strain to the increase of guilt, and from hence that they spoke favorable things also, they point out that credit is to be given them in the reverse, and with more seeming truth they imitate evil things, in proportion as they commended the good with seeming zeal. Thus they wrest words of favorable import to the service of accusation, and that they afterwards more deeply wound the life of the righteous from the same source, whence a little before in semblance they vindicate it. But it often happens that their good qualities, which they first condemn when possessed, they afterwards admire as if departed. And hence Eliphaz, as he declares them to be departed, subjoins the virtues of the holy man, enumerating them and saying, verse 6, Where is thy fear, thy strength, thy patience, and the perfectness of thy ways? All which same he makes to succeed that sentence which he set before, saying, But now a stroke is come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Thus he declares that they were brought to naught, all of them together, and this, that he blames blessed Job's being troubled by the scourge. Yet it is to be well taken notice of, that though he chides unbefittingly, yet the ranks of virtue he fitly describes. For in enumerating the virtues of blessed Job, he marked out his life in 4 stages, in that he both added strength to fear, and patience to strength, and to patience perfection, since one sets out in the way of the Lord with fear, that he may go on to strength. For as in the world boldness begets strength, so in the way of God boldness engenders weakness. And as in the way of the world fear gives rise to weakness, so in the way of God fear produces strength. As Solomon witnesses, who says, In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence. For strong confidence is said to be the fear of the Lord, and that in truth our mind so much the more valorously sets at naught all the terrors of temporal vicissitudes, the more thoroughly that it submits itself in fear to the author of those same temporal things. And being established in the fear of the Lord, it encounters nothing without to fill it with alarm, in that whereas it is united to the Creator of all things by a righteous fear, it is by a certain powerful influence raised high above them all. For strength is never shown saving in adversity, and hence patience is immediately made to succeed to strength. For every man proves himself in a much truer sense to have advanced in strength in proportion as he bears with the bolder heart the wrongs of other men. For he was a little strong in himself, who was brought to the ground by the wickedness of another. He, in that he cannot bear to face opposition, lies pierced with the sword of his cowardice. But forasmuch as perfection springs out of patience, immediately after patience we have the perfectness of his ways introduced. For he is really perfect who feels no impatience towards the imperfection of his neighbor. Since he that goes off, not being able to bear the imperfection of another, in his own witness against himself, that he is not yet perfectly advanced. Hence truth says in the gospel, "In your patience possess ye your souls." For what is it to possess our souls, but to live by the rule of perfection in all things, to command all the motions of the mind from the citadel of virtue? He then that maintains patience possesses his soul, and that from hence he is endued with strength to encounter all adversities, whence even by overcoming himself he is made master of himself, and as he quells himself in a manner worthy of all praise, he comes forth unquelled with dauntless front, because by conquering himself in his pleasures, he makes himself invincible to reverses. But as Eliphaz rebuked him with reviling, so now he adds a few words, as if in exhortation, saying, verse 7, "Remember, I pray thee, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off?" Whether it be heretics, of whom we have said that the friends of blessed Job bore an image, or whether any of the forward ones, they are as blamable in their admonitions as they are immoderate in their condemnation. For he says, "Who ever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off?" Since it often happens that in this life both the innocent perish and the righteous are utterly cut off, yet in perishing they are reserved to glory eternal. For if none that is innocent perished, the prophet would not say, "The righteous perish, and no man layeth it to heart." If God in his providential dealings did not carry off the righteous, wisdom would never have said of the righteous man, "Yea, speedily he was taken away, lest that wickedness should alter his understanding." If no visitation ever smote the righteous, Peter would never foretell it, saying, "For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God." They then that are really righteous, who are furnished forth by the love of the country above, to meet all the ills of the present life, for all that fear to endure ills here, for the sake of eternal blessings, clearly are not righteous men. But Eliphaz does not take account either that the righteous are cut off, or that the innocent perish here, in that oftentimes they serve God, not in the hope of heavenly glory, but of earthly recompense, make a fiction in their own head of that which they are seeking after, and taking upon themselves to be instructors, in preaching earthly immunity, they show by all their pains what is the thing they love. It goes on, verses 8 and 9, "Even as I have seen, they that plough iniquity, and sow sorrows, and reap the same, by the blast of God do they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils are they consumed." To sow griefs is to utter deceits, but to reap griefs is to prevail by so speaking. Or surely they sow griefs who do forward actions, they reap griefs when they are punished for this forwardness. For the harvest of grief is the recompense of condemnation, and whereas it is immediately introduced that they that sow and reap griefs perish by the blast of God, and are consumed by the breath of his nostrils. In this passage the reaping of grief is shown to be not punishment as yet, but the still further perfecting of wickedness. For in the breath of his nostrils the punishment of that reaping is made to follow. Here then they sow and reap griefs, in that all that they do is wicked, and they thrive in that very wickedness. As is said of the wicked man by the psalmist, "His ways are always grievous, thy judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them." And it is soon after added concerning him, "Under his tongue is labor and grief." So then he sows griefs when he does wicked things. He reaps griefs when from the same wickednesses he grows to temporal greatness. How then is it that they perish by the blast of God, who are for the most part permitted to abide long here below, and in greater prosperity than the righteous? For hence it is said of them again by the psalmist, They are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other folk. Hence Jeremiah saith, Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? For because, as it is written, For the Lord is a long-suffering rewarder. He oftentimes for long bears with those whom he condemns for all eternity. Yet sometimes he strikes quickly, in that he hastens to the succor of the pusillanimity of the innocent. Therefore Almighty God sometimes permits the wicked to have their own way for long, that the ways of the righteous may be more purely cleansed. Yet sometimes he slays the unrighteous with speedy destruction, and by their ruin he strengthens the hearts of the innocent. For if he were now to smite all that do evil, on whom would he yet have to show forth the final judgment? And if he never at any time smote any man, who would ever have believed that God regarded human affairs? Sometimes then he strikes the bad, that he may show that he does not leave wickedness unpunished. But sometimes he bears with the wicked for long, that he may teach the heedful what judgment they are reserved for. Thus the sentence of the cutting off of the wicked, if it be not spoken of all men in general, at the end of this present state of being, is undoubtedly to a great degree made void by the force of truth. But it will then be true, when iniquity shall no longer have reprieve. And perchance it may be more rightly taken in this sense, since neither the innocent perishes, nor the upright is cut off, and that though here he is worn out in the flesh, yet in the sight of the eternal Judge he is renewed with true health. And they that sow and reap griefs perish by the blast of God, and that in proportion as they go on here deeper in doing wickedly, they are the more severely stricken with the damnation to follow. But whereas he premises this sentence with the word remember, it is clearly evident that something past is recalled to mind, and not anything future proclaimed. Then, therefore, Eliphaz would have spoken more truly if he had believed that these things were wrought on the head of the wicked in general by final vengeance. But this point that God is said to breathe claims to be more practically made out, for we, when we breathe, draw the air from without within us, and thus drawn within we give it forth without. God then is said to breathe in recompensing vengeance, in that from occasions without he conceives the purpose of judgment within him, and from the eternal purpose sends forth the sentence without. When God breathes, as it were, somewhat is drawn in from things without. When he sees our evil ways without, and ordains judgment within, and again, as if by God's breathing, the breath is sent forth from within, when from the internal conception of the purpose, the outward decree of condemnation is delivered. And so it is rightly said that they that sow griefs perish by the breath of God. For wherein they execute wicked deeds outwardly, they are deservedly stricken from within. Or surely when God is said to breathe, in that the breath of his wrath is immediately introduced, by the designation of his breathing may be denoted that very visitation of his. For when we are wroth, we kindle with the breath of rage. To show the Lord, then mediating vengeance, he is said to breathe in his indignation, not that in his own nature he is capable of turning or change, but that after long endurance, when he executes vengeance upon the sinner, he who continueth tranquil in himself seems in commotion to them that perish. For whereas the condemned soul sees the judge arrayed against its doings, he is exhibited to it as troubled, in that it is itself troubled by its own guiltiness before his eyes. But after he had in appearance exhorted him with clemency, he openly subjoins language of reproach, saying, End of Book 5, Section 4. Book 5, Section 5. of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Verse 10. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the lioness, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. For what does he call the roaring of the lion? But as we have said a little above, the severer character of that man. What the voice of the lioness, but his wife's loquacity? What the teeth of the young lions, but the greediness of his children? For because his sons had perished when feasting, they are denoted by the term of teeth. And while unsparing Eliphaz rejoices that they are all broken, he denounces them as deservedly condemned. And he yet further doubles the cruelty of his reproaches when he adds, verse 11, The tiger perisheth for lack of prey, and the stout lion's whelps are scattered abroad. For whom does he denote by the name of tiger, but blessed Job, marked with the stamp of changeableness, or covered with the spots of dissimulation? For every dissembler, in that he desires to appear righteous, can never show himself pure in all things. For while he assumes some virtues in hypocrisy, and secretly gives way to vicious habits, some concealed vices speedily break out upon the surface, and exhibits the hide of overlaid hypocrisy, like a coat for sight, varied with their admixture, so that it is very often a marvel how one who is seen to be master of such great virtues should at the same time be stained with such damnable deeds. But truly every hypocrite is a tiger, in that while he derives a pure color from pretense, it is stripped with the intermediate blackness of vicious habits. For it often happens that while he is extolled for pureness of chastity, he renders himself foul by the stain of avarice. Often while he makes a fair show by the good quality of bountifulness, he is stained with spots of lust. Often while he is clad in the bright array of bountifulness and chastity, he is blackened by ferociousness and cruelty, as if from zealous sense of justice. Often he is arrayed in bounty, chastity, pitifulness, in a fair outside, but is marked with the interspersed darkness of pride. And thus it comes to pass that, whereas by the intermixture of vicious habits the hypocrite does not present an unstained appearance in himself, the tiger, as it were, cannot be of one color. And this same tiger seizes the prey, and that he usurps to himself the glory of human applause. For he that is lifted up by usurped praise is, as it were, glutted with the prey. And it is well that the applause that hypocrites have is called prey, for it is naught else than a prey, when the things of another are taken away by violence. Know every hypocrite, in that by counterfeiting the life of righteousness, he seizes for himself the praise that belongs to the righteous, does in truth carry off what is another's. Thus Eliphaz, who knew that blessed Job had walked in ways worthy to be praised in the period of his well-being, concluded from the stroke that came after that he had maintained these in hypocrisy, saying, The tiger perisheth for lack of prey, as if he had plainly said, The shifting of thine hypocrisy is at an end, because the homage of applause is also taken from thee, and thine hypocrisy is in lack of prey, and that being stricken by the hand of God, it lacks the favorable regards of man. But in the translation of the Septuagint, it is not said the tiger, but the myrmecolion perisheth for lack of prey. For the myrmecolion is a very little creature, a foe to ants, which hides itself under the dust, and kills the ants laden with grains, and devours them thus destroyed. Now myrmecolion is rendered in the Latin tongue either the ant's lion, or indeed more exactly, an ant and lion at once. Now it is rightly called an ant and lion, in that with reference to winged creatures, or to any other small-sized animals, it is an ant, but with reference to the ants themselves it is a lion, for it devours these like a lion. Yet by the other sort it is devoured like an ant. When Eliphaz says, The ant-lion perisheth, What does he censure in blessed Job under the title of ant-lion, but his fearfulness and audacity? As if he said to him in plain words, Thou art not unjustly stricken, in that thou hast shown thyself a coward towards the lofty, a bully towards those beneath thee. As though he had said in plain terms, Fear made thee crouch towards the crafty sort. Hardihood swelled thee full towards the simple folk. But the ant-lion no longer hath prey, in that thy cowardly self-elation, being beaten down with blows, is stayed from doing injury to others. But for as much as we have said that the friends of blessed Job contain a figure of heretics, there is a pressing necessity to show how these same words of Eliphaz are to be understood in a typical sense likewise. Verse 10. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the lioness and the teeth of the young lions are broken. For as much as the nature of everything is compounded in different elements, in Holy Writ different things are allowably represented by any one thing, for the lion has magnanimity, it has also ferocity. By its magnanimity, then, it represents the Lord, by its ferocity the devil. Hence it is declared of the Lord, Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David hath prevailed. Hence it is written of the devil, Your adversary the devil, like a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. But by the title of a lioness, sometimes Holy Church, sometimes Babylon is represented to us. For on this account, that she is bold to encounter all that withstand, the Church is called a lioness, as is proved by the words of blessed Job, who in pointing out Judea forsaken by the Church, says, The sons of traitors have not trodden, nor the lioness passed by it. And sometimes under the title of a lioness is set forth the city of this world, which is Babylon, which ravens against the life of the innocent with terribleness of ferocity, which being wedded to our old enemy, like the fiercest lion, conceives the seeds of his forward counsel, and produces from her own body reprobate sons, as cruel whelps after his likeness. But the lion's whelps are reprobate persons, engendered to a life of sin by the misleading of evil spirits, who both all of them together constitute the great city of the world, which we have declared before, even Babylon. And yet these same sons of Babylon severally are called not a lioness, but a lioness's whelps. For as the whole church together is denominated Zion, but the several individual saints the sons of Zion, so both the several individuals among the reprobate are called the children of Babylon, and all the reprobate together are designated by the same Babylon. But so long as good men remain in this life, they keep watch over themselves with anxious heed, lest the lion that goeth about surprise them by guile, i.e., lest our old enemy slay them under some show of virtue, lest the voice of the lioness stun their ears, i.e., lest the glory of Babylon catch away their minds from the love of the heavenly country, lest the teeth of the young lions bite them, i.e., lest the promptings of the reprobate gain power in their hearts. But on the other hand, heretics are already as if secured touching holiness, because they fancy that they have surmounted all obstacles by the preeminent merit of their life. And hence it is said here, the roaring of the lion and the voice of the lioness and the teeth of the young lion are broken. As though it were expressed in plain words, we for this reason are never beaten and bruised with any strokes, for that we tread under at once the might of the old enemy and the lust of earthly glory and the promptings of all the reprobate, overcoming them by the preeminence of our life. Hence it is further added, verse 11, The tiger perishes for lack of prey, and the lion's whelps are scattered abroad. By the title of a tiger, he again represents him whom he formerly designated by the name of a lion. For Satan, both for his cruelty, is called a lion, and for the variousness of his manifold cunning, he is not unsuitably designated a tiger. For one, while he presents himself to man's senses, lost as he is, one while he exhibits himself as an angel of light, now by caressing he works upon the minds of the foolish sort, now by striking terror he forces them to commit sin. At one time he labors to win men to evil ways without disguise. At another time he cloaks himself in his promptings under the garb of virtue. This beast, then, which is so variously spotted, is rightly called a tiger, being with the Septuagint called an antlion, as we have said above, which same creature, as we have before shown, hiding itself in the dust, kills the ants carrying their corn, and that the apostate angel, being cast out of heaven upon the earth, in the very pathway of their practice, besets the minds of the righteous, providing for themselves the provender of good works, and whilst he overcomes them by his snares, he is, as it were, kills by surprise, the ants carrying their grains. And he is rightly called antlion, i.e., a lion and ant. For, as we have said, to the ants he is a lion, but to the birds of the air an ant, and that our old enemy, as he is strong to encounter those that yield to him, is weak against such as resist him. For if consent be yielded to his persuasions, like a lion he can never be sustained. But if resistance is offered, like an ant he is ground in the dust. Therefore to some he is a lion, to others an ant, in that carnal minds sustain his cruel assaults with difficulty, but spiritual minds trample upon his weakness with virtue's foot. Heretics, then, because they are full of pride, by pretension to sanctity, say as it were in exaltation, the antlion, or probably, the tiger has perished for lack of prey. As though the words were plainly expressed, the old foe has no prey in us, in that as far as regards our purposes, he already lies defeated. Now it is for this reason that he is again mentioned under the title of an antlion, or of a tiger, who had been already set forth by the roaring of the lion broken, because whatever is said in joy is repeated over and over, for when the mind is full of exaltation, it redoubles the expressions, and hence the psalmist from true joy frequently repeats this, that he was assured that he had been heard, saying, The Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping, the Lord hath heard my supplications, the Lord hath received my prayer. But when holy men are glad of heart, they have been rescued from some evil habits. They possess themselves with great fear, even in that very gladness. For though they be now rescued from the commotion of any single storm, yet they call to mind that they are still tossing in the treacherous waves of an uncertain sea, and they so exult in hope that they tremble in fear, and so tremble in fear that they exult in confidence of hope. Whence it is said by the same psalmist, Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. But on the other hand, they whom a spacious show of sanctity fills with big thoughts, when they get the better of any one evil habit, immediately erect their heart in pride, and as it were glory in the perfection of their lives. And for this, that perchance they have been once snatched from the perils of the storm, they already forget that they are still at sea. They look upon themselves as great in all things, and imagine that they have wholly overcome their old adversary. They regard all men below them, and that they believe that their wisdom places them above all. Whence it is added, Now a secret word was spoken to me. A secret word heretics pretend to hear, that they may bring a certain reverence for their preaching over their hearers' minds, and hence they preach with a secret meaning, that their preaching may seem to be holy, in proportion as it is at the same time hidden. Now they are loth to have a common sort of knowledge, lest they should be placed on par with the rest of their fellow creatures, and they are ever making out new things, which, whilst others know nothing of, they plume their own selves on the preeminence of their knowledge before inexperienced minds. And this knowledge, as we have said, they teach is occult, for that they may be able to show it to be wonderful. They affirm that they obtained it by secret means. Hence with Solomon, the woman bearing the semblance of heretics says, Stolen waters are sweetened, and bread eaten in secret is more pleasant. Whence in this place too it is added, And mine ear, as it were, by stealth received the veins of the whispering thereof. They receive the veins of whisperers by stealth, in that, abandoning the grace of knowledge and fellowship, they do not enter thereunto by the door, as the Lord witnesses, who says, He that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up another way, the same as a thief and a robber, but he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. Therefore he receives the veins of divine worshippers by stealth, who whilst the door of public preaching for the receiving of the knowledge of his excellency is forsaken, searches out the gaps and chinks of a forward understanding. But because the thief and robber, who enters by another way, both loves the darkness and abhors the clearness of the light, it is properly added. End of Book 5, Section 5. Book 5, Section 6. Of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Verse 13. In the horror of a vision of the night, when deep sleep falleth on men. It often happens that while heretics are bent to discourse of things above them, they become their own witnesses against themselves. That what they deliver is not true, for in a vision of the night the sight is uncertain. Therefore they declare that they received the inklings of whispers, in the terror of a vision of the night. For in that the things which they teach may be made to appear sublime to others, they declare that they themselves can scarcely comprehend them. But it may be inferred from hence how far that can be rendered certain to their hearers, which they themselves beheld but dubiously. And so it is marvelously ordered that while they run on speaking of sublime things, in the exposure of folly they are entangled in the very words of their sublimity. Now to what heights they rear themselves for singularity of wisdom is shown, when he adds in the same breath, when deep sleep falleth upon men, as if it were openly said by heretics, when men are asleep beneath, we wake to receive heavenly truths, and that to us all that is known, to the knowledge whereof the dull hearts of men cannot arise, as if they said in plain words, in things wherein our understanding rises erect, the faculties of the rest of the world lie asleep. But sometimes when they see that this is disregarded by the hearer, they feign that they are themselves in fear of what they say. Whence it is added, verse 14, Fear came upon me in trembling, which made all my bones to shake. For because they desire to appear objects of wonder for the loftiness of their instructions, they affect to be awed at the accounts which they make up. And whilst it is less difficult to hear than to speak, they are bold enough to put forth that which, forsooth, they feign that they the very same persons were scarcely able to hear. Whence it is added yet further, verses 15 and 16, And when a spirit passed before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. There stood one, but I knew not the face of him. That they may show that they have been made acquainted with incomprehensible mysteries, they relate not that a spirit stood still, but that it passed by before their face. And they pretended that they beheld a countenance they knew not, that they may prove themselves to be known to him, whom the human mind is not equal to know. And here it is further added, An image was before mine eyes, and I heard the voice, as it were, of a light breath of air. Heretics often picture God to themselves by a sensible form, seeing that they are unable to behold him spiritually, and they tell that they hear his voice as a light breath of air, and that for the obtaining of the knowledge of his secret things, they delight to have as if a particular freedom of intercourse with him. For they never teach the things which God reveals openly, but such as are breathed into their ears in a secret manner. All this, then, we have said, to indicate what we are to look for in the words of Eliphaz, as he bears the semblance of heretics. But for as much as the friends of blessed Job would never have been the friends of one so great, unless they had evidently learned something of truth, which same, while they go wrong in uttering sentences of rebuke, yet do not altogether totter in the knowledge of the truth. Let us return upon these same words a little way back, that we may make out more exactly how the things which are said concerning the perception of truth may be delivered in a true sense by persons viewing things aright. Now sometimes heretics utter things both true and lofty, not that they themselves receive them from above, but because they have learnt them in the controversy of Holy Church. Nor do they apply them to the furtherance of conscious living, but to the display of scientific skill, whence it very commonly happens that by knowing they tell high truths, yet in living they know nothing what they tell. Therefore, whether as they represent heretics who hold not the life but the words of knowledge, or whether in the person of the friends of blessed Job, who doubtless with regard to their knowledge of the truth, might in seeing realize what they aimed in teaching to give utterance to, let us more minutely examine these sayings, which we have gone through, that while the words of Eliphaz are carefully gone into, it may be shown what knowledge he possessed, though in that knowledge he failed to retain humility, who appropriated to himself particularly a belief common to all. For he says, verse 12, Now a hidden word was spoken to me. For the invisible Son is called the hidden word, concerning whom John saith, In the beginning was the Word, which he, the same person, teaches to be hidden, in that he adds, And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But this hidden word is delivered to the minds of the elect, when the power of the only begotten Son is made manifest to believers. By the hidden word we may also understand the communication of inward inspiration, concerning which it is said by John, His anointing teacheth you of all things, which same inspiration, on being communicated to the mind of man, lifts it up, and putting down temporal interest, inflames it with eternal desires, that nothing may any longer yield its satisfaction but the things that are above, and that it may look down upon all that, from human corruption, is in a state of uproar below. And so to hear the hidden word is to receive in the heart the utterance of the Holy Spirit, which same indeed can never be known save by him whom it may be possessed. And hence it is said by the voice of truth concerning this hidden utterance, And I pray the Father, and he shall give you another Comforter, that he may abide with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive. For as that Comforter, after the ascension of the Mediator, being another consoler of mankind, is in himself invisible, so he inflames each one that he has filled to long after the invisible things. And because worldly hearts are set upon the things that are seen alone, the world receiveth him not, because it doth not rise up to the love of the things that are unseen. For worldly minds, in proportion as they spread themselves out in interests without, contract the bosom of the heart against the admission of him. And because out of mankind there are few indeed, who being purified from the pollution of earthly desires, are opened by that purification to the receiving of the Holy Spirit, this word is called a hidden word, since surely there are particular persons that receive that in the heart, which the generality of men know nothing of. Or truly the same inspiration of the Holy Spirit is a hidden word, in that it may be felt but cannot be expressed by the noise of speech. When then the inspiration of God lifts up the soul without noise, a hidden word is heard, and that the utterance of the Spirit sounds silently in the ear of the heart. And hence it is added, And mine ear, as it were, stealthily received the veins of the whispering thereof. The ear of the heart receives stealthily the veins of heavenly whispering, in that both in a moment and in secret the inspired soul is made to know the subtle quantity of the inward utterance. For except it bury itself from external objects of desire, it fails to enter into the internal things. It is both hidden that it may hear, and it hears that it may be hidden, in that at one and the same time, being withdrawn from the visible world, its eyes are upon the invisible, and being replenished with the unseen, it entertains a perfect contempt for what is visible. But it is to be observed that he does not say, Mine ear received, as it were, by stealth the whispering thereof, but the veins of the whispering thereof. For the whispering of the hidden word is the very utterance of inward inspiration itself. but the veins of the whispering is the name for the sources of the occasions, whereby that inspiration itself is conveyed to the mind. For it is as if it opened the veins of its whispering, when God secretly communicates to us in what ways he enters into the ear of our understandings. Thus at one time he pierces us with love, at another time with terror. Sometimes he shows us how little the present scene of things is, and lifts up our heart to desire the eternal world. Sometimes he first points to the things of eternity, that these of time may after that grow worthless in our eyes. Sometimes he discloses to us our own evil deeds, and thence draws us on even to the point of feeling sorrow for the evil deeds of others also. Sometimes he presents to our eyes the evil deeds of others and reforms us from our wickedness, pierced with a wonderful feeling of compunction. And so to hear the veins of divine whispering by stealth is to be made to know the secret methods of divine inspiration, at once gently and secretly, though we may interpret whether the whispering or the veins of whispering in another way yet, for he that whispers is speaking in secret, and he does not give out, but imitates a voice. We therefore, so long as we are beset by the corruptions of the flesh, in no wise behold the brightness of the divine power, as it abides unchangeable in itself, and that the eye of our weakness cannot endure that which shines above us with intolerable luster from the ray of his eternal being. And so when the Almighty shows himself to us by the chinks of contemplation, he does not speak to us but whispers, in that though he does not fully develop himself, yet something of himself he does reveal to the mind of man. But then he no longer whispers at all, but speaks, when his appearance is manifested to us in certainty. It is hence that truth saith in the Gospel, I shall show you plainly of the Father. Hence John saith, For we shall see him as he is. Hence Paul saith, Then shall I know even as also I am known. Now in this present time the divine whispering has as many veins for our ears as the works of creation, which the divine being himself is Lord of. For while we view all things that are created, we are lifted up in admiration of the Creator. For as water that flows in a slender stream is sought by being bored forth through veins with the view to increase it, and as it pours forth the more copiously in proportion as it finds the veins more open, so we, whilst we heedfully gather the knowledge of the divine being from the contemplation of his creation, as it were, open to ourselves the veins of his whispering, in that by the things that we see have been made, we are led to marvel at the excellency of the Maker, and by the objects that are in public view, that issues forth to us, which is hidden in concealment. For he bursts out to us in a kind of sound as it were, whilst he displays his work to be considered by us, wherein he betokens himself in a measure, in that he shows us how incomprehensible he is. Therefore, because we cannot take thought of him as he deserves, we hear not his voice, yea, scarcely his whispering. For because we are not equal to form a full and perfect estimate of the very things that are created, it is rightly said, Mine ear, as it were by stealth, received the veins of whispering, and that being cast forth from the delights of paradise, and visited with the punishment of blindness, we scarcely take in the veins of whispering, since his very marvelous works themselves we consider but hasty and slight. But we must bear in mind that in proportion as the soul, being lifted up, contemplates his excellency, so being held back, it shrinks from his righteous perfectness. And hence it is rightly added, verse 13, in the horror of a vision of the night. The horror of a vision of the night is the shuddering of secret contemplation. For the higher the elevation, whereat the mind of man contemplates the things that are eternal, so much the more, terror-struck at her temporal deeds, she shrinks with dread, and that she thoroughly discovers herself guilty, in proportion as she sees herself to have been out of harmony with that light, which shines in the midst of darkness above her, and then it happens that the mind, being enlightened, entertains the greater fear, as it more clearly sees by how much it is at variance with the rule of truth. And she that before seemed as it were more secure in seeing nothing, trembles with sore fright from her very own proficiency itself. Though whatever her progress in virtue, she does not as yet compass any clear insight into eternity, but still sees with the indistinctness of a certain shadowy imagining, and hence this same is called a vision of the night. For as we have also said above, in the night we see doubtfully, but in the day we see steadily. Therefore, because as regards the contemplating the ray of the interior sun, the cloud of our corruption interposes itself, nor does the unchangeable light burst forth such as it is to the weak eyes of our mind, we as it were still behold God in a vision of the night, since most surely we go darkling under a doubtful sight. Yet though the mind may have conceived but a distinct idea concerning him, yet in contemplation of his greatness she recoils with dread, and is filled with a greater awe, in that she feels herself unequal even to the very skirts of the view of him. Falling back upon herself, she is drawn to him with closer bonds of love, whose marvelous sweetness, being unable to bear, she has but just tasted of under an indistinct vision, but because she never attains to such an height of elevation, unless the importunate and clamorous throng of carnal desires be first brought under governance, it is rightly added, when deep sleep falleth upon men. Whoever is bent to do the things which are of the world is as it were awake, but he that seeking inward rest eschews the riot of this world sleeps as it were. But first we must know that in Holy Scripture sleep, when put figuratively, is understood in three senses. For sometimes we have expressed by sleep the death of the flesh, sometimes the stupefaction of neglect, and sometimes the tranquillity of life, upon the earthly desires being trodden under foot. Thus by the designation of sleep or slumbering, the death of the flesh is implied, as when Paul says, "And I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep." And soon after, "Even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him." Again by sleep is designated the stupefaction of neglect, as where it is said by that same Paul, "Now it is high time to awake out of sleep." And again, "Awake ye righteous, and sin not." By sleep too is represented tranquillity of life, when the carnal desires are trodden down, as where these words are uttered by the voice of the spouse in the Song of Songs, "I sleep, but my heart waketh." For in truth, in proportion as the holy mind withholds itself from the turmoil of temporal desire, the more thoroughly it attains to know the things of the interior, and is the more quick and awake to inward concerns, the more it withdraws itself out of the sight from external disquietude. And this is well represented by Jacob sleeping on his journey. He put his stone to his head and slept. He beheld a ladder from the earth fixed in heaven, the Lord resting upon the ladder, angels also ascending and descending. For to sleep on a journey is, in the passage of this present life, to rest from the love of things temporal. To sleep on a journey is, in the course of our passing days, to close those eyes of the mind to the desire of visible things, which the seducer opened to the first of mankind, saying, "For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened." And hence it is soon afterwards added, "She took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat, and the eyes of them both were opened." For sin opened the eyes of concupiscence, which innocence kept shut. But to see angels ascending and descending is to mark the citizens of the land above, either with what love they cleave to their Creator above them, or with what fellow feeling in charity they condescend to aid our infirmities. End of Book 5, Section 6. Book 5, Section 7. Of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First, This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. And it is very deserving of observation that he that lays his head upon a stone is he who sees the angels in his sleep, surely because that same person, by resting from external works, penetrates internal truths, who with mind intent, which is the governing principle of man, looks to the imitating of his Redeemer. For to lay the head upon a stone is to cleave to Christ in mind. Since they that are withdrawn from this life's sphere of action, yet whom no love transports above, may have sleep, but can never see the angels, because they despise to keep their head upon a stone. For there are some who fly indeed the business of the world, but exercise themselves in no virtues. These indeed sleep from stupefaction, not from serious design, and therefore they never behold the things of the interior, because they have laid their head not upon a stone, but upon the earth, whose lot it most frequently is, that in proportion as they rest more secure from outward actions, the more aptly they are gathering in themselves from idleness an uproar of unclean thoughts. And thus under the likeness of Judea the prophet bewails the soul, stupefied by indolence, where he says, "The adversaries saw her, and did mock at her Sabbaths. For by the precept of the law there is a cessation from outward work upon the Sabbath day. Thus her enemies looking on mock her at her Sabbaths, when evil spirits pervert the very waste hours of vacancy to unlawful thoughts, so that every soul, in proportion as it is supposed to be devoted to the service of God, by being removed from external action, the more it drudges to their tyranny, by entertaining unlawful thoughts. But good men who sleep to the works of the world, not from inertness but from virtue, are more laborious in their sleep than they would be awake. For herein, that by abandoning they are made superior to this world's doings, they daily fight against themselves, maintaining a brave conflict, that the mind be not rendered dull by neglect, nor subdued by indolence, cool down to the harboring of impure desires, nor in good desires themselves be more full of fervor than is right, nor by sparing itself under the pretext of discretion may slacken its endeavor after perfection. These are the things she is employed withal. She both wholly withdraws herself from the restless appetite of this world, and gives over the turmoil of earthly actions, and in pursuit of tranquillity, bent on virtuous attainments, she sleeps waking, for she is never led on to contemplate internal things, unless she be heedfully withdrawn from those which entwine themselves about her without. And it is hence that truth declares by his own mouth, no man can serve two masters. Hence Paul saith, no man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him that hath chosen him to be a soldier. Hence the Lord charges us by the prophet, saying, Be still, and know that I am the Lord. Therefore, because inward knowledge is not cognizable by us, except there be a rest from outward embarrassments, the season of the hidden word and of the whisperings of God is in this place rightly set forth, when it is said, in the horror of a vision in the night, when deep sleep falleth upon men, in that truly our mind is never caught away after the force and power of inward contemplation, unless it be first carefully lulled to rest from all agitation of earthly desires. But the human mind, lifted on high by the engine, as it were, of its contemplation, in proportion as it sees things higher above itself, the more terribly it trembles in itself, and hence it is fitly added, verse 14, Fear came upon me in trembling, which made all my bones to shake. What is denoted by bones but strong deeds? Which also it is said by the prophet, He keepeth all their bones. And it often happens that the things which men do they reckon to be of some account, because they know not how keen is the discernment of his inward sifting. But when transported on the wings of contemplation, they behold things above, in some sort they melt away from the security they felt in their presumption, and quake in sight of God the more, in proportion as they do not even reckon their excellences fit for the searching eye of him whom they behold. For it is hence that he, who had gained ground in doing strong deeds, being lifted up by the Spirit, exclaimed, All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like unto thee? As though he said, My flesh is without words, in that my infirmities are wholly silent before thee. But my bones sing the praises of thy greatness, in that the very things which I thought to be strong in me tremble at the view of thee. It is hence that Manoah, shrinking at the vision of the angel, says, We shall surely die, for we have seen the Lord, whom his wife immediately comforts with these words, If the Lord were pleased to kill us, he would not have received a burnt offering and a meat offering at our hand. But how is it that the man becomes fearful at the vision of the angel, and the woman bold? But that as often as heavenly things are shown us, the spirit indeed is shaken with affright, yet hope has confidence. For hope lifts itself to dare greater feats from the same cause, whereby the spirit is troubled, in that it sees the things that are above. Therefore, because when the mind, being lifted on high, beholds the higher depths of the secrets of heaven, all that is more solid of human strength trembles. It is well said here, Fear came upon me in trembling, which made all my bones to shake, as though it were expressed in plain words, when I perceived the secrets of inmost subtlety, in that quarter where I thought myself in my own eyes strong, I faltered in the sight of the judge. For contemplating the strictness of divine justice, we justly fear even for the very works themselves, which we flatter ourselves we had so done that they were strong. For our uprightness, when drawn parallel to the inward rule, if it meets with strict judgment, comes cross, with many sinuosities of the windings, to the inward uprightness. And hence when Paul both perceived that he had the bones of the several virtues, and yet that these same bones trembled under the searching scrutiny, he saith, But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self, for I know nothing against myself. Yet because, when the veins of the divine whispering were heard, these same bones quaked, he hereupon added, For I am not hereby justified, but he that judgeth me is the Lord. As though he were to say, I remember that I have done right things, yet I presume not on my merits. For our life is brought to the scrutiny of him, under whom even the bones of our strength are dismayed. But when the mind is suspended in contemplation, when, exceeding the narrow limits of the flesh, with all the power of her ken, she strains to find something of the freedom of interior security, she cannot for long rest standing above herself, because though the spirit carries her on high, yet the flesh sinks her down below by the yet remaining weight of her corruption. And hence it is added, verse 15, And as the Spirit passed before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. The Spirit passes before our face, when we are brought to the knowledge of invisible things, and yet see these same not steadfastly, but with a hasty glance. For not even in the sweetness of inward contemplation does the mind remain fixed for long, and that being made to recoil by the very immensity of the light, it is called back to itself. And when it tastes that inward sweetness, it is on fire with love. It longs to mount above itself, yet it falls back in broken state to the darkness of its frailty. And advancing in high perfection, it sees that it cannot yet see that which it ardently loves, which yet it would not love ardently did it not in some sort see the same. Thus the spirit is not stationary, but passes by, because our contemplation both discloses to us that pant thereafter the heavenly light, and forthwith conceals the same from us, failing from weakness. And because in this life, whatever degree of virtue a man may have advanced to, he still feels the sting of corruption. For the corruptible body presseth down on the soul, and the earthly tabernacle weigheth down the mind that museth upon many things. Therefore it is rightly added, the hair of my flesh stood up. For the hairs of the flesh are all the superfluities of human corruption. The hairs of the flesh are the imaginations of the former life, which we so cut away from the mind, that we let no grief for the loss of them disturb our peace. And it is well said by Moses, let the Levites shave all the hairs of their flesh. For a Levite is rendered taken, and thus it behooves the Levites to shave all the hairs of the flesh, and that he who is taken into the divine ministrations ought to show himself clear of all imaginations of the flesh before the eyes of God, that the mind never put forth unlawful thoughts, and so deform the fair appearance of the soul, as it were by sprouting hairs. But whatever perfection of holy living may have raised the condition of any man, yet there still springs up to him from his old state of life somewhat to bear, and hence the same hairs of the Levites are commanded to be shaven, not to be plucked out, for the roots still remain in the flesh to the shaven hairs, and grow again to be again cut off, and that while we are to use great diligence in cutting off all rank thoughts, yet they never can be wholly and entirely cut off. For the flesh is ever engendering a rank produce, which the spirit should ever be cutting away with the knife of heedfulness. Yet it is then that we see these things with more exactness, when we penetrate into the heights of contemplation. And hence it is rightly said, whilst the Spirit passed before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. For when the human mind is lifted up on the tower of contemplation, it the more cruelly torments itself for its superfluities, in proportion as it perceives that which it loves to be infinitely refined. And when it beholds that beautiful being which it longs for, above its own height, it severely judges everything infirm in itself, which it bore with tranquillity before. Therefore, when the Spirit passeth by, the hairs quake, and that before the power of compunction all rank thoughts flee away, that naught that is loose, naught that is dissipated, any longer gives pleasure, for severity of inward visitings kindles the inspired soul even against its own self. And when that which rises up in the heart of an unlawful kind is cut away with unintermitted strictness, it very often happens that the invigorated soul enters into its ray of contemplation with a somewhat larger range, and almost arrests the spirit which was passing by. Yet does not this same lingering of contemplation fully discover the force of the divine nature, for its vastness transcends all human powers, thus enlarged and elevated. And hence it is well added, verse 16, there stood a certain one, but I could not discern the form thereof. For we do not speak of a certain one, saving surely in the case of him whom we are either unwilling or unable to express. Now with what feeling it is here said a certain one is clearly set forth, and that it immediately comes in, but I could not discern the form thereof. For the human soul, being by the sin of the first of mankind banished from the joys of paradise, lost the light of the invisible, and poured itself out entire in the love of the visible, and was darkened in the interior sight, in proportion as it was dissipated without to the deformment of itself, whence it comes to pass that it knows nothing, saving the things that it acquaints itself with by the palpable touch, so to say, of the bodily eyes. For man who, had he been willing to have kept the commandment, would even in his flesh have been a spiritual being, by sinning was rendered even in soul carnal, so as to imagine such things only as he derives to the soul through the images of bodily substances. For body is the property of heaven, earth, water, animals, and all visible things, which he unceasingly beholds. And while the delighted mind wholly precipitates itself into these, it waxes gross, loses the fineness of the inward sense, and whereas it is now no longer able to erect itself to things on high, it willingly lies prostrate in its weaknesses and things below. But when with marvelous efforts it strives to rise up from the same, it is great indeed, for the soul, thrusting aside the bodily form, is brought to the knowledge of itself, so as to think of itself without a bodily figure, and by thus thinking of itself to prepare itself a pathway to contemplate the substance of eternity. Now in this way it shows itself to its own eyes as a kind of ladder, whereby in ascending from outward things to pass into itself, and from itself to tend unto its Maker. For when the mind quits bodily images, entering into itself, it mounts up to no mean height. For though the soul be incorporeal, yet because she is incorporate with the body, she is known by that property of hers, which is confined within the local bounds of the flesh. And whereas she forgets things known, acquaints herself with such as are unknown, remembers what has been consigned to oblivion, entertains mirth after sadness, is adjudged to punishment after joy. She herself shows by her own diversity in herself how widely she is removed from the substance of eternal unchangeableness, which is always the same, even as it is, which everywhere present, everywhere invisible, everywhere whole and entire, everywhere incomprehensible, is by the longing mind discerned without seeing, heard without uncertainty, taken in without motion, touched without bodily substance, held without locality. Now when the mind that is used to corporal objects represents to itself this same substance, it is loaded with the phantasms of diverse images. And whilst it banishes these from the eyes of its attention with the hand of discernment, making everything give place thereto, it at last beholds it in some degree. And if it does not as yet apprehend what it is, it has surely learnt what it is not. And so because the mind is carried away into unaccustomed ground, when it pries into the essence of the deity, it is rightly said here, a certain one stood, and I could not discern the form thereof. And it is well said, it stood still. For every created thing, in that it is made out of nothing, and of itself tends to nothing, has not the property to stand, but to run to an end. But a creature endowed with reason, by this very circumstance, that it is created after the image of its Maker, is fixed that it should not pass into nothing. Now no irrational creature is ever fixed, but only so long as, by the service of its appearing, it is completing the form and fashion of the universe. It is delayed in passing away, for though heaven and earth abide henceforth and forever, still they are at this present time of themselves, hastening on to naught. Yet for the use of those whom they serve, they remain to be changed for the better. To stand, then, is the attribute of the Creator alone, through whom all things pass away, himself never passing away, and in whom some things are held fast, that they should not pass away. Hence our Redeemer, because the fixed state of his divine nature could not be comprehended by the human mind, showed this to us, as it were, in passing, by coming to us, by being created, born, dead, buried, by rising again and returning to the heavenly realms, which he well shadowed out in the gospel by the enlightening the blind man, to whom when passing on he vouchsafed a hearing, but it was standing still that he healed his eyes. For by the economy of his human nature he had his passing on, but the standing by the power of his divine nature, in that he is everywhere present. Thus the Lord is said to hear the complaints of our blind condition in passing, and that being made man he had compassion on human misery. But he restores light to the eyes standing still, in that he enlightens the darkness of our frail state by the efficacy of his divine nature. It is well, then, that, after it has been said, then a spirit passed before my face, it should be added, but I could not discern the form thereof. As if it were in plain words, him whom I perceived in passing, I discovered never to pass. He then that passes is the same as he that stands still. He passes in that when known he cannot be detained. He stands still in that so far as he is known, he is seen to be unchangeable. Therefore, because he that is ever the same is seen by a hasty glance, God at the same time appears both passing and standing still. or surely his standing is his never varying with any change. As it is said to Moses, I am that I am. And as James represents him, saying, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Now whereas every man that apprehends something of the eternal being by contemplation beholds the same through his co-eternal image, it is rightly subjoined, an image was before mine eyes. End of Book 5, Section 7. Book 5, Section 8. Of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For the image of the Father is the Son, as Moses teaches in the case of man at his creation. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. And as the wise man, in the setting forth of wisdom, saith concerning the same Son, for she is the brightness of the everlasting light. And as Paul hath it, who being the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person. When then his eternity is perceived, as far as the capability of our frail nature admits, his image is set before the eyes of the mind, in that when we really strain towards the Father, as far as we receive him, we see him by his image, i.e. by his Son, and by that image which was born of himself without beginning, we strive in some sort to obtain a glimpse of him, who hath neither beginning nor ending, and hence this same truth saith in the Gospel, No man cometh to the Father but by me. And it is well added, And I heard the voice as if it were of a light breath. For what is signified by the voice of a light breath, but the knowledge of the Holy Spirit, which proceeding from the Father, and receiving of that which belongeth to the Son, is gently imparted to the knowledge of our frail nature. Yet when it came upon the apostles, it is demonstrated by an outward sound, like a vehement blast, where it is said, And suddenly there came a sound from heaven, as of a mighty rushing wind. And when the Holy Spirit imparts itself to the knowledge of frail humanity, it is both represented by the sound of a rushing mighty wind, and also by the voice of a gentle breath. Clearly, in that when it comes, it is both vehement and gentle in that it tempers the knowledge of itself to our perceptions, so as to be in some sort brought under our cognizance. Vehement in that, however, it may temper that same, yet by its coming it confounds while it illuminates the darkness of our frail condition. For it touches us but lightly by its enlightening influence, yet it shakes our emptiness with fearful might. So God's voice is heard as if of a light breath, in that the divine being never imparts himself as he is to those that contemplate him while still in this life, but to the purblind eyes of our mind he discovers his brightness but scantily, which is well represented by that very receiving of the law itself, when it is said that Moses ascended, and God descended upon the mount. For the mount is our very contemplation itself, whereunto we ascend, that we may be elevated to see those things which are beyond our frail nature. But the Lord descends thereupon, in that when we advance much, he discloses some little concerning himself to our perceptions, if either little or somewhat can be said to be in him, who, being always one and abiding the same, cannot be understood by parts, and yet is said to be participated by his faithful servants, whereas part is no wise admissible in his substance, but because we are unable to express him with perfect speech, being hindered by the scanty measure of our human nature, as by the impotency of the infant state, we give back an echo of him in some sort with stammering utterance. But what then we are lifted up in high contemplation, it is somewhat refined that we attain unto the knowledge of the Eternal One, is shown by the words of sacred story, when the illustrious prophet Elijah is instructed in the knowledge of God. For when the Lord promised him that he would pass by before him, saying, And behold, the Lord passeth by, a great and strong wind, rending the mountains, and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. He thereupon added, But the Lord is not in the wind. And after the wind a quaking, but the Lord is not in the quaking. And after the quaking a fire, but the Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. For the wind before the Lord overturns the mountains, and shatters the rocks. In that the affright which rushes in upon us from his coming, both casts down the exaltation of our hearts, and melts their hardness. But the Lord is said not to be in the wind of quaking, and in the fire, but it is not denied that he is in the still small voice, and that verily, when the mind is hung aloft in the height of contemplation, whatever it has power to see perfectly and completely is not God, but when it sees something of great fineness, this is the same as that he hears belonging to the incomprehensible substance of the deity. For we as it were perceive a still small voice, when by a moment's contemplation we taste with finest sense the savour of incomprehensible truth. Accordingly then, only is there truth in what we know concerning God, when we are made sensible that we cannot know anything fully concerning him. Hence it is well added in that place, and it was so when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood at the entering in of the cave. After the still small voice, the prophet covers his face with his mantle, because in that very refined contemplation he learns in what a cloak of ignorance man is shrouded. For to draw the mantle over the face is to veil the mind by the consideration of its own infirmity, that it may never presume to seek things above it, and that it never rashly open the eyes of the understanding beyond itself, but close them with a feeling of awe to that which it cannot apprehend. And he, in doing such things, is described to have stood at the entering in of the cave. For what is our cave but this dwelling place of our corrupt nature, wherein we are still held fast from remaining oldness? But when we begin to take in something of the knowledge of the divine being, we, as it were, already stand in the entering in of the cave. For as we cannot make perfect progress, yet panting after the knowledge of the truth, we already catch something of the breadth of liberty. So to stand at the entering in of the cave is forcing aside the obstruction of our corrupt nature, to begin to issue forth to the knowledge of the truth. And hence upon the cloud descending on the tabernacle, the Israelites, seeing it afar off, are related to have stood at the entering in of their tents, in that they who in some sort behold the coming of the deity, as it were, already issue forth from their habitation of the flesh. Therefore, because with whatever amplitude of virtue the human mind may have enlarged its compass, yet it scarcely knows the very outmost extremes that belong to the interior things. It is rightly said here, and I heard a voice as of a light breath. But as at the same time that the knowledge of the deity shows us after all but little concerning itself, it is perfectly instructing the ignorance of our infirmness. Let him that heard the voice of a light breath declare all that he learnt by the same hearing. It goes on, verse 17, Shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his Maker? Human righteousness compared with the righteousness of God is unrighteousness. For even a candle is seen to shine bright in the dark, but being set in the ray of the sun, its light is darkened. What then did Eliphaz learn when he was transported in contemplation, saving that man cannot be justified in comparison with God? For we believe that what we do outwardly is righteous, but when we never at all acquaint ourselves with the things of the interior, we are, as it were, blind, whilst set in the ray of the sun. But when we, little as we can, discern the one, it is not a little that we judge the others, and that a man judges the darkness more exactly, in proportion as the brightness of light is more truly manifested to him. For he that seeth light knoweth what to account of the darkness, as he that is ignorant of the whiteness of light lets pass even dark objects for light ones. And it is rightly added, Shall a man be more pure than his Maker. For whoso murmurs at the stroke, what does he but charge the justice of the striker? Thus a man accounts himself more pure than his Maker, if he stirs complaint against the scourge, and without doubt he makes him give place to himself, whose judgment he blames in the case of his own affliction. Thus that man may never dare charge his judge with offense. Let him humbly bethink himself that he is the author of nature, for he that with marvelous skill made man out of nothing does not pitilessly afflict him that he has made, which Eliphaz then learnt when he heard the voice, as it were, of a light breath. For by the contemplation of the greatness of God, we learn how humbly we should abase ourselves with fear under his visitation. And he that hath a taste of things below bears with resignation all events below, in that he perfectly sees within, whereat he should reckon that which he does without. For he miscounts himself righteous, who knows not the rule of the supreme righteousness. And it often happens that a piece of wood is counted straight, if it be not applied to the rule. But so soon as it is put thereto, we discover the degree of distortion wherewith it swells out, in that truly the straight line cuts off and condemns that, which the cheated eye approved as good. Thus Eliphaz, in that he beheld things above, delivered a strict judgment on all below. And though it was not rightly he reproved blessed Job, yet by comparison with the Creator of all things, he rightly describes the measure of the creature, saying, verses 18 and 19, Behold, his servants are not steadfast, and in his angels he found folly. How much more in them that dwell in the houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which shall be consumed as by the moth. Though the angelic nature, by being fixed in contemplation of the Creator, remains unchangeable in its own state, yet hereby, that it is a created thing, it admits in itself the variableness of change. Now to be changed is to go from one thing to another, and to be without stability in oneself. For every single being tends to some other thing by steps, as many in number as it is subject to motions of change. And it is only the incomprehensible nature which knows not to be moved from its fixed state, in that it knows not to be changed from this, that it is always the same. For if the essence of the angels had been strange to the motion of change, being created well by its Maker, it would never have fallen in the case of reprobate spirits from the power of its blessed state. But Almighty God, in a marvelous manner, framed the nature of the highest spiritual existences good, yet at the same time capable of change, that both they that refused to remain might meet with ruin, and they that continued in their own state of creation might henceforth be established therein more worthily in proportion as it was owing to their own choice, and become so much the more meritorious in God's sight, as they had stayed the motion of their mutability by the establishing of the will, whereas then this very angelic nature too is in itself mutable, which same mutability it has hereby overcome, in that it is bound by the chains of love to him who is ever the same. It is now rightly said, Behold, his servants are not steadfast. And there is forthwith added a proof of this same mutability, in that it is brought in from the case of the apostate spirits, and in his angels he found folly. And from the fall of these he rightly draws the consideration of human frailty, when he appeals thereto. How much more in them that dwell in the houses of clay, whose foundation is earthly, which shall be consumed as by the moth? For we inhabit houses of clay, in that we subsist in earthly bodies, which Paul considering saith, But we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And again, for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, an house not made with hands, an earthly foundation, too, is the substance of the flesh, which the psalmist had earnestly contemplated in himself, when he said, My bones are not hid from thee, which thou madest in secret, and my substance is in the lower parts of the earth. Now the moth springs from the garment, and its production destroys that very garment whereupon it is produced. And the flesh is as a kind of garment to the soul, but this same garment has withal its moth, in that from itself there arises carnal temptation, whereby it is rent and torn. For our garment is, as it were, consumed by a kind of moth of its own, in that the corruptible flesh engenders temptation, and by this is brought to destruction. Man is consumed as if by a moth, in that he has arising from himself that whereby he is to be broken in pieces, as though it were, in plain words, if those spirits cannot be of themselves unchangeable, which are kept down by no infirmity of the flesh, by what inconceivable temerity do men account themselves to hold on steadfastly in good, who wherein they have their understanding elevated them on high, have the clog of carnal frailty, acting as an impediment to them, so that through the evil of a corrupting tendency they contain a cause in themselves, whence they turn old from the interior newness. The holy doctors may likewise be understood by the angels, according as it is said by the prophet, for the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the angel of the Lord of hosts. With whatever degree of virtue these may shine, they can never be altogether without sin, so long as they are engaged in the journey of this life, in that their step is doubtlessly brought into contact either with the mire of unlawful practice or with the dust of the thought of the heart. Now they dwell in houses of clay, who rejoice in this ensnaring life of the flesh. Paul had been brought to condemn the inhabiting this house of clay, when he said, "But our conversation is in heaven." Let him say then, "Behold, his servants are not steadfast, and in his angels he hath found folly. How much more in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are consumed as by the moth?" As if he had said in plain words, if the pathway of this present life cannot be passed through without defilement by those who, proclaiming the things of eternity, gird themselves up to encounter those of time, what evils do they undergo, who rejoice to be plunged in the delights of the fleshly habitation? For his servants are not steadfast. For when the mind strains towards things on high, it is dissipated by the conceits of its own flesh, so that oftentimes, whilst the mind pants after the things of the interior, while it looks at heavenly objects alone, smitten by a momentary carnal delight, it lies low, severed from itself, and he that felt joy that he had surmounted the hindrances of his frailty, prostrated by an unexpected wound, is only filled with woe. Perverseness then is found even in his angels, so long as those very men who proclaim his truth, the surprisals of a deceitful life, do at times lie heavy on. So then, if even those are smitten by the wickedness of this world, whom a holy purpose presents erect against the same, with what strokes are they not pierced, whom nothing less than delight in their frailty brings to the ground before its darts? And these are well described to be consumed, as it were, with a moth. For a moth does mischief, and makes no sound. So the minds of the wicked, in that they neglect to take account of their own losses, lose their soundness, as it were, without knowing it. For they are losing innocency from the heart, truth from the lips, continency from the flesh, and in the course of time, life from the sum of their age. But they see not one whit that they are unceasingly letting go these same, and that they are busied with all their heart and temporal concerns. Thus they are consumed, as it were, with a moth, in that they suffer the canker of sin without sound, whilst they remain ignorant what losses in life and innocency of heart they are undergoing. Hence it is well added, verse 20, "They shall be cut off from morning till evening." For the sinner is cut off from morning to evening, and that from the beginning of his life to the end thereof, he is ever getting wounded by the commission of sin. For the reprobate, by increase in wickedness, are at all times redoubling blows upon themselves, cut off by which they may fall headlong into the pit. And it is well said of them by the psalmist, "Bloody and deceitful men shall not have their days. But to have our days is to part off the time of our life misspent in pleasure, for the purpose of penitential mourning, and in parting off to recover the same to a good use. But the wicked never have their days, in that not even in the end of their time do they change their forwardness of heart. Contrary whereunto Paul rightly exhorts, saying, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. For we redeem the time, when by tears we recover our past life, which by writing we had lost. It goes on. End of Book 5, Section 8. Book 5, Section 9. Of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. And because none understandeth, they perish forever. That is to say, none of those who shall be cut off from morning until evening. None understandeth, whether of those that perish, or of those that follow the lost ways of the perishing. Whence it is elsewhere written, the righteous perish, and no man layeth it to heart, and merciful men are taken away, none considering. Thus, whereas the wicked are set upon temporal things alone, and are unconcerned to learn what blessings are in store for the elect in everlasting, while they look to the affliction of the just, but never learn what is the recompense of that affliction, they put forth the foot of their conversation into the pit, for they willingly shut their eyes to the light of understanding, for being decoyed by foolish pleasures, whilst for objects which they see they entertain an affection, which belongs to time. Being meanwhile strangers to them, they never see whereunto they are hurrying for all eternity. It is possible, too, that by the morning may be denoted the prosperous fortune of this world, and by the evening the adverse fortune thereof. So then the wicked are cut off from morning to evening, in that by running riot through prosperity they are brought to ruin, and being made impatient by adversity, they are lifted up to madness. These would never be cut off from morning to evening by sin, if they either took prosperity for the slave or adversity for the knife to the sore. But for as much as the assemblage of the human race is never forsaken, that the whole is let to go to destruction, there be some that look down upon the enjoyments of the present life, even when they are present, consider that they are transient, and in the love of the eternal world tread them under foot. And while they set the step of judgment on this first stage, they mount with invigorated soul to a loftier height, so that they not only condemn all temporal things, for that they must be quickly parted with, but have no desire to attach themselves thereto, even if they might last forever. And they withdraw their love from the things created in beauty, because they stretch forth by the steps of the heart toward the Father of all beauty himself. And there are some that love the good things of the present life, yet never in any wise attain unto them, who pant after temporal blessings with all their heart's desire, who covet the glory of the world, yet never can make themselves master thereof. For these, so to speak, the hearts draw them on to seek the world. The world drives them back to search out the heart. For it often chances that, being bruised by those very adversaries which they suffer, they are brought back to reason, and returning back unto themselves, they consider how little there is in that which they are seeking after, and forthwith betake themselves to weeping for the foolishness of their desire, and conceive the stronger yearnings for eternal things, in proportion to the folly in which they grieve that they once spent themselves for those of time. Hence the wicked having been described, it is well added, verse 21, but they that have been left shall be taken away from among them. Whom else do we understand by the left, but all the despised of this world, whom whilst the present life chooses not for any use of honor, it leaves as being the least and most worthless. But the Lord is said to take away those that are left of the world, and that he condescends to make choice of the despised of this life, as Paul bears witness, saying, not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble or called, But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty, which is well represented in the book of the Kings by the Egyptian servant fainting in the way, whom the Amalekite abandons taken sick upon the journey. But David finds, refreshes with food, and makes the guide of his route. He pursues the Amalekite, finds him feasting, and utterly destroys him. For what does it mean that the Egyptian servant of the Amalekite turns faint upon the journey, but that the lover of this present world, covered with the blackness of his sins, is often abandoned in weakness and contempt by the same world, so that he is no longer able to run therewith, but being broken down by adversity, grows helpless. But David finds him, in that our Redeemer, who is in a true sense strong of hand, sometimes turns to the love of himself those whom he finds despised as to the glory of the world, in that he refreshes them with the knowledge of the word. He chooses him the guide of his way, in that he makes him even the preacher of himself. And he that had no power to follow the Amalekite becomes the guide of David, in that he whom the world forsook as worthless, not only when converted entertains the Lord in his affections, but by preaching him brings him home even to the hearts of others. And with this same guide, David discovers and annihilates the Amalekite as he feasted, and that Christ breaks up the joy of the world by those very men as preachers, whom that world scorned to have for its companions. Therefore, because it very often happens that those whom the world abandons are chosen of the Lord, it is rightly said in this place, those that may have been left shall be taken from amongst them. It proceeds, they shall die, even without wisdom. How is it that he is set forth above the death of the wicked, saying, because none understandeth, they shall perish forever, and concerning the elect of God, thereupon subjoined, and they that have been left shall be taken away from among them. Yet forthwith adds that which cannot accord with those elect ones, saying, they shall die even without wisdom. For if they be taken away from among the wicked by the hand of God, how are they said to die without wisdom? Why, doubtless it is the fashion of Holy Writ, in relating anything, after inserting a sentence that concerns another case, to return straightway to its former subject. Thus, after he had said, and because there is none that understandeth, they shall perish forever, he immediately brought in the lot of the elect, saying, but they that have been left shall be taken away from among them. And again directing the eye of his meaning to that destruction of the wicked, which he had foretold, he suddenly subjoined, they shall die even without wisdom, as if he said, those of whom I said that, not understanding they should perish forever, will assuredly die without wisdom. But we shall the better show that this is at times the way with Holy Writ, if we produce therefrom a similar instance to this. For when Paul the Apostle was counseling his beloved disciple for the settling the offices of the church, that he might not by chance without due order promote any to holy orders, he said, lay hands suddenly on no man, neither be partaker of other men's sins. Keep thyself pure, and forthwith, directing his words to his bodily infirmities, he says, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake, and for thine often infirmities. And he immediately subjoins, some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment, and some men they follow after. What connection then has that, which he added concerning the sins of different men, being hidden and manifest, with this, that he forbade him in his weak health to drink water, but that after the insertion of a clause concerning his weakness of health, he came back again at the end to that which he had said before. Lay hands suddenly on no man, neither be partaker of other men's sins. For in order to show with what anxious heed these same sins are to be inquired into, after introducing a charge to prudence directed against the annoyance of bad health, he straightway put in, that in some men they lay exposed to view, in some hidden from sight, saying, some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment, and some men they follow after. As then in this sentence Paul does not chime in with these same words, to which, speaking of the weakness of Timothy's health, he subjoined it, but he has returned to that which he made mention of before, after an interruption. So when in this place Eliphaz said concerning the elect, "They that have been left shall be taken from among them," by subjoining thereupon, "They die even without wisdom," he therefore recurs to that which he delivered concerning the wicked, saying, "Because none understandeth, they shall perish forever." Now it is for this reason that the wicked look down upon the elect, because they are going toward a life that is invisible through a death that is visible, of whom it is well said in this place, "They die even without wisdom." For though it were said in plain words, they equally indeed eschew death and wisdom they wholly get quit of, but they do not escape the snares of death, and whereas doomed as they are to die one day, they might in dying have received life. While they dread the death which will most surely come, they part both with life and wisdom together. But on the other hand, the righteous die in wisdom, for that death which they cannot wholly avoid, when it threatens them for the sake of truth, they refuse to put off to a latter day, and whilst they undergo the same with resignation, they turn the punishment of their race into an instrument of virtue, that life may be received back from the same quarter, whence for the deserts of the first sin it is forced to its end. But because Eliphaz delivered these things with a true meaning against the wicked, in accounting blessed Job to be worthy of blame, he puffed himself up in pride of wisdom, and hence after declarations so good and righteous, he subjoins words of mocking, and says, chapter 5, verse 1, "Call now, if there be any that will answer thee." For Almighty God often passes by the prayer of that man in his trouble, who slights his precepts in the season of rest. Hence it is written, "He that turneth away his ear from hearing the law, even his prayer shall be an abomination." Now for us to call is to beseech God with humble prayer, but for God to answer is to vouchsafe an accomplishment to our prayers. And so he says, "Call now, if any will answer thee," as though he said in plain words, however thou mayest cry in thy distress, thou hast not God answering for thee, and that the voice in tribulation findeth not him, whom the mind of tranquility disregarded. Where he adds in yet further derision, "And turn thee to some one of the saints," as though he said in scorn, "The saints too thou canst never obtain for abettors in thy distress, whom thou wouldest not have for companions in thy mirth." And after this mocking he forthwith adds the sentence, saying, verse 2, "For wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly man." Which same verse would have been true had it not been delivered against the patience of so great a man. Let us weigh well the thing that he said, though it be made to recoil by the virtue of his hearer, that we may show how right the matter is which is put forth, if it were not unjustly put forth against blessed Job, since it is written, "But thou, Lord, judgest with tranquility." We must above all things know that as often as we restrain the turbulent motions of the mind under the virtue of mildness, we are essaying to return to the likeness of our Creator. For when the peace of the mind is lashed with anger, torn and rent, as it were, it is thrown into confusion, so that it is not in harmony with itself, and loses the force of the inward likeness. Let us consider how great the sin of anger is, by which, while we part with mildness, the likeness of the image of the Most High is spoilt. By anger wisdom is parted with, so that we are left wholly in ignorance what to do, and in what order to do it. As it is written, "Anger resteth in the bosom of a fool," in this way that it withdraws the light of understanding, while by agitating it troubles the mind. By anger life is lost, even though wisdom seem to be retained. As it is written, "Anger destroyeth even the wise." For in truth the mind, being in a state of confusion, never puts it in execution, even if it has power to discern anything with good judgment. By anger righteousness is abandoned. As it is written, "The wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." For whereas the agitated mind works up to harshness the decision of its reasoning faculty, all that rage suggests it accounts to be right. By anger, all the kindliness of social life is lost. As it is written, "Be not the companion of an angry man, lest thou learn his ways, and get a snare to thy soul." And the same writer, "Who can dwell with a man whose spirit is ready to wrath? For he that does not regulate his feelings by the reason that is proper to man must needs live alone like a beast." By anger harmony is interpreted. As it is written, "A wrathful man stirreth up strife, and an angry man diggeth up sins." For an angry man diggeth up sins, since even bad men whom he rashly provokes to strife, he makes worse than they were. By anger the light of truth is lost. As it is written, "Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." For when wrath brings into the mind the darkness of perturbation, God hides therefrom the ray of the knowledge of himself. By anger the brightness of the Holy Spirit is shut out. Contrary whereunto, it is written according to the old translation, "Upon whom shall my spirit rest, saving upon him that is humble and peaceful, and that trembleth at my words." For when he mentioned the humble man, he forthwith subjoined the word peaceful. If then anger steals away peace of mind, it shuts its dwelling place against the Holy Spirit, and the soul being left void by its departure is immediately carried into open frenzy, and is scattered away to the very surface from the inmost foundation of the thoughts. For the heart that is inflamed with the stings of its own anger beats quickly, the body trembles, the tongue stammers, the countenance takes fire, the eyes grow fierce, and they that are well known are not recognized. With the mouth indeed he shapes a sound, but the understanding knows nothing what it says. Wherein then is he removed from brain-struck persons, who is not conscious of his own doings? Whence it very often comes to pass that anger springs forth even to the hands, and as reason is gone the further, it lifts itself up the bolder, and the mind has no strength to keep itself in, for that it is made over into the power of another, and frenzy employs the limbs without in dealing blows, in proportion as it holds captive within the very mind. That is the mistress of the limbs, but sometimes it does not put out the hands, but it turns the tongue into a dart of cursing, for it implores with entreaty for a brother's destruction, and demands of God to do that, which the wicked man himself is either afraid or ashamed to do. And it comes to pass that both by wish and words he commits a murder, even when he forbears the hurting of his neighbor with his hands. Sometimes when the mind is disturbed, anger, as if in judgment, commands silence, and in proportion as it does not vent itself outward by the lips, inwardly it burns the worse. So the angry man withholds from converse with his neighbor, and in saying nothing, says how he abhors him. And sometimes this rigorness of silence is used in the economy of discipline, yet only if the rule of discretion be diligently retained in the interior. But sometimes, whilst the incensed mind forgoes the wonted converse, in the progress of time it is wholly severed from the love of our neighbor, and sharper stings arise to the mind, and occasions too spring up which abrogate her irritation, and the mote in the eye of the angry man is turned into a beam, whilst anger is changed into hatred. It often happens that the anger which is pent up within the heart from silence burns the more fierce, and silently frames clamorous speeches, presents to itself words, by which to have its wrath exasperated, and as if set in judgment on the case, answers in exasperation exceeding cruelty, as Solomon implies in few words, saying, "But the expectation of the wicked is wrath." And thus it is brought to pass that the troubled spirit finds louder riot in its silence, and the flame of pent-up anger preys upon it the more grievously. Hence a certain wise man said well before us, "The thoughts of the angry man are a generation of vipers. They devour the mind which is their mother." But we are to know that there be some whom anger is somewhat prompt and inflaming, but quickly leaves them, while there are others whom it is slow and exciting, but the longer in retaining possession of. For some, like kindled reeds, while they clamor with their voices, give out something like a crackle at their kindling. Those indeed speedily rise into a flame, but when they forthwith cool down into their ashes. Whilst others, like the heavier and harder kinds of wood, are slow in taking fire, but being once kindled, are with difficulty put out, and as they slowly stir themselves into heat of passion, retain the longer the fire of their rage. Others again, and their conduct is the worst, are both quick in catching the flames of anger, and slow in letting them go. Others both catch them slowly, and part with them quickly. In which same four sorts, the reader sees clearly that the last rather than the first approaches to the excellence of peace of mind. And in evil the third is worse than the second. But what good does it do to declare how anger usurps possession of the mind, if we neglect to set forth at the same time how it should be checked? For there are two ways whereupon anger being broken comes to relax its hold upon the mind. The first method is that the heedful mind, before it begins to do anything, set before itself all the insults which it is liable to undergo, so that by thinking on the opprobrious treatment of its Redeemer, it may brace itself to meet with contradiction, which same on coming it receives with the greater courage, in proportion as by foresight it armed itself the more heedfully. For he that is caught by adversity unprovided for it is as if he were found by his enemy sleeping, and his foe dispatches him the sooner, that he stabs one who offers no resistance. For he that forecasts impending ills in the spirit of earnest heedfulness, as it were watching an ambush, awaits the assault of his enemy, and he arrays himself in strength for the victory in the very point wherein he was expected to be caught in entire ignorance. Therefore, before the outset of any action, the mind ought to forecast all contraries, and that with anxious heed, that by taking account of these at all times, and being at all times armed against them with the breastplate of patience, it may both in foresight obtain the mastery, whatever may take place, and whatever may not take place, it may account gain. But the second method of persevering mildness is that when we regard the transgressions of others, we have an eye to our own offenses, by which we have done wrong in the case of others. For our own frailty being considered makes excuse for the ills done by us by others, since that man bears with patience an injury that is offered him, who with right feeling remembers that perchance there may still be somewhat in which he himself has need to be borne with. And it is as if fire were extinguished with water, when upon rage rising up in the mind, each person recalls his own misdoings to his recollection, for he is ashamed not to spare offenses, who recollects that he has himself often committed offenses, whether against God or against his neighbor, which need to be spared. But herein we must bear in mind, with nice discernment, that the anger which hastiness of temper stirs is one thing, and that which zeal gives its character to is another. The first is engendered of evil, the second of good. For if there was no anger originating in virtue, Phineas would have never allayed by the fierceness of God's visitation by his sword. Because Eli lacked such anger, he quickened against himself the stirrings of the vengeance of the Most High to an implacable force. For in proportion as he was lukewarm towards the evil practices of those under his charge, the severity of the eternal ruler waxed hot against himself. Of this it is said by the psalmist, "Be ye angry and sin not," which doubtless they fail to interpret aright, who would only have us angry with ourselves, and not with others likewise when they sin. For if we are bidden to love our neighbors as ourselves, it follows that we should be as angry with the erring ways as with our own evil practices. Of this it is said by Solomon, "Anger is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better." Of this the psalmist saith again, "Mine eye is disturbed because of anger." For anger that comes of evil blinds the eye of the mind, but anger that comes from zeal disturbs it. since necessarily in whatever degree he is moved by a jealousy of virtue, the world of contemplation, which cannot be known saving by a heart in tranquillity, is broken up. For zeal for the cause of virtue in itself, in that it fills the mind with disquietude and agitation, presently bedims the eye thereof, so that in its troubled state it can no longer see those objects far up above, which aforetime clearly beheld in a state of tranquillity, but it is brought back on high with a more penetrating ken by the same means, whereby it is thrown back for a while so as to be incapable of seeing. For the same jealousy in behalf of what is right, after a short space, opens wider the scenes of eternity in a state of tranquillity, which in the mean season it closes from the effects of perturbation, and from the same quarter whence the mind is confounded so as to prevent its seeing, it gains ground, so as to be made clear for seeing in a more genuine way. Just as when ointment is applied to a diseased eye, light is wholly withheld, but after a little space it recovers this in truth and reality by the same means, by which it lost the same for its healing. But to perturbation, contemplation is never joined, nor is the mind, when disturbed, enabled to behold that which even when in a tranquil state it scarcely has power to gaze on. For neither is the sun's rays discerned when driving clouds cover the face of the heavens, nor does a troubled fountain give back the image of the beholder, which when calm it shows with a proper likeness. For in proportion as the water thereof quivers, it bedims the appearance of a likeness within it. But when the spirit is stirred by zeal, it is needful to take good heed, that same anger which we adopt as an instrument of virtue never gain dominion over the mind, nor take the lead as mistress, but like a handmaid, prompt to render service, never depart from following in the rear of reason. For it is then lifted up more vigorously against evil, when it does service in subjection to reason, since how much soever our anger may originate in zeal for the right, if from being in excess it has mastered our minds, it thereupon scorns to pay obedience to reason, and spreads itself the more shamelessly in proportion as it takes the evil of a hot temper for a good quality, whence it is necessary that he who is influenced by zeal for right should above all things look to this, that his anger should never overleap the mind's control, but in avenging sin, looking to the time and the manner, should check the rising agitation of his mind, by regulating it with nicety of skill, should restrain heat of temper, and control his passionate emotions in subjection to the rule of iniquity, that the punisher of another man may be made more just, in proportion as he has first proved the conqueror of himself, so that he should correct the faults of transgressors in such a way that he that corrects should himself first make advancement by self-restraint, and pass judgment on his own vehemency in getting above it, lest by being immoderately stirred by his very zeal for right, he go far astray from the right. But as we have said, forasmuch as even a commendable journey for virtue troubles the eye of the mind, it is rightly said in this place, for wrath killeth the foolish man, as if it were in plain terms, anger from zeal disturbs the wise, but anger from sin destroys the fool. For the first is kept under control of reason, but the other lords over the prostrate mind in opposition to reason. And it is well added, and envy slayeth the little one. For it is impossible for us to envy but those whom we think to be better than ourselves in some respect. And so he is a little one who is slain by jealousy, for he bears witness against his very own self, that he is less than him by envy of whom he is tormented. It is hence that our crafty foe, in envying of the first man, despoiled him, and that having lost his estate of bliss, he knew himself to be inferior to his immortality. It is hence that Cain was brought down to commit the murder of his brother, and that when his sacrifice was disregarded, he was maddened that he whose offering God accepted was preferred to himself, and whose being better than himself was his aversion, he cut off, that he might not be at all. Hence Esau was fired to the persecution of his brother, for the blessing of the firstborn being lost, which, for that matter, he had himself parted with for a mess of pottage, he bewailed his inferiority to him, whom he surpassed by his birth. Hence his own brethren sold Joseph to Ishmaelites that were passing by, and then upon the mystery of the revelation being disclosed, they set themselves to resist his advancement, that he might never become superior to themselves. Hence Saul persecutes his servant David by throwing a lance at him, for he dreaded that man growing beyond his own measure, whom he perceived to be daily waxing bigger by his great achievements in the virtues. Thus he is a little one who is slain by envy, and that except he himself proved less, he would not grieve for the goodness of another. But herein we must bear in mind that though in every evil thing that is done, the venom of our old enemy is infused into the heart of man, yet in this wickedness the serpent stirs his whole bowels, and discharges the bane of spite, fitted to enter deep into the mind, of whom also it is written, Nevertheless, through envy of the devil came death into the world. For when the foul sore of envy corrupts the vanquished heart, the very exterior itself shows how forcibly the mind is urged by madness. For paleness seizes the complexion, the eyes are weighed down, the spirit is inflamed, while the limbs are chilled, there is frenzy in the heart, there is gnashing with the teeth, and while the growing hate is buried in the depths of the heart, the pent wound works into the conscience with a blind grief. Not of its own that is prosperous gives satisfaction, and that a self-inflicted pain wounds the pining spirit, which is racked by the prosperity of another, and in proportion as the structure of another's works is reared on high, the foundations of the jealous mind are deeper undermined, that in proportion as others hasten on toward to better things, his own ruin should be the worse, by which same downfall even that is brought to the ground, which was believed to have been raised in other doings with perfect workmanship. For when envy has made the mind corrupt, it consumes all that it may have found done aright. Whence it is well said by Solomon, A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy the rottenness of the bones. For what is denoted by the flesh, saving weak and tender things, and what by the bones, saving strong deeds? And it is most common that some with real innocency of heart should appear to be weak in some points of their practice, whilst some now perform deeds of strength before the eyes of men, but yet towards the excellences of others they are inwardly consumed with the plague of envy. And so it is well said, A sound heart is the life of the flesh, in that where inward innocency is preserved, even if there be some points weak without, yet they are sometime made strong and fast. And it is rightly added, But envy the rottenness of the bones, for by the bad quality of envy even strong deeds of virtue go for naught before the eyes of God, since the rotting of the bones from envy is the spoiling of the strong things even. But why do we say such things concerning envy, unless we likewise point out in what manner it may be rooted out? For it is a hard thing for one man not to envy another that which he earnestly desires to obtain, since whatever we receive, that is of time, becomes less to each in proportion as there are many to divide it amongst. And for this reason envy wrings the longing mind, because that which it desires another man getting either takes away altogether or curtails in quantity. Let him then who longs to be wholly and entirely void of the bane of envy set his affections on that inheritance which no number of fellow heir serves to stint or shorten, which is both one to all and whole to each, which is shown so much the larger as the number of those that are vouchsafed it is enlarged for its reception. And so the lessening of envy is the feeling of inward sweetness arising, and the utter death of it is the perfect love of eternity. For when the mind is withdrawn from the desire of that object, which is divided among the multitude of participators, the love of our neighbor is increased, in proportion as the fear of injury to self from his advancement is lessened. And if the soul be wholly ravished in love of the heavenly land, it is also thoroughly rooted in the love of our neighbor, and that without any mixture of envy. For whereas it desires no earthly objects, there is nothing to withstand the love it has for its fellow. And what else is this same charity but the eye of the mind, which if it be reached by the dust of earthly love, is forthwith beaten back with injury from its gaze at the inward light. But whereas he is a little one who loves earthly things, and a great one that longs after the things of eternity, it may be subtly enough rendered in this sense likewise, and envy slayeth the foolish one, in that no man perishes by the sickness of this plague, except him that is still unhealthy in his desires. End of Book 5. End of Morals on the Book of Job, Volume 1, Part 1, by Pope Gregory the First.